Hey everybody, it's Jay, and about a year ago I did a video review on the very first sword that I ever bought, which is this one. This is the Noble Plants Jian, made by Iron Tiger Forge out of Longchuan, China. I did try to pronounce Jian the correct way, the Chinese way, depending on what dialect you have, and got corrected in that video. So since there is not a direct pronunciation in American English for letters that don't exist in American English from Chinese, I'm just going to stick with calling it Jian because that is the correct way to pronounce it if you're an American English speaker like me. In that year, since I bought this very first sword, I've learned a lot about swords. Now, I'm still not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I definitely know a lot more about swords now than what I did then. So I thought it might be kind of interesting to go back and take a look at the sword and look at the specifics and how it performs with the knowledge that I've acquired over the last year. So first off, we'll start with the very heart and soul, that was the scabbard falling, of the sword. This is made of a mix of 1045 and 1065 folded high carbon steel. Now, one thing that I've learned is a lot of cheap swords and knives, and that's not necessarily to say low end, but a lot of cheap swords and knives will use the term Damascus to describe their steel, their folded steel. A lot of times they'll say this has 10,000 folds or something along those lines, and just use the term Damascus generically to describe the steel material. Now, this sword says 1045 and 1065, which is decent, but not great. Definitely not the best high carbon steel. It is still a high carbon steel, so it's not bad, but it could be better. This is not a Damascus, so-called Damascus sword that you often see, because those, like I said, a lot of times they won't tell you what the material is, and you'll end up getting soft material that just does not hold up very well. Sometimes the edge is very soft. It won't hold an edge. Sometimes they can be prone to breakage. So this is not one of those swords. But I have learned a little bit about what Damascus is and why sword and knife guys tend to speak with a certain tone whenever they talk about Damascus. And you'll hear a lot of people joke about the 10,000 folds thing whenever they talk about Damascus. This is not that case. Like I said, we know what the steel content is. It's fine. It could be better, but if it's properly tempered and properly heat treated, then it should be just fine from a durability standpoint. I've also learned a lot about cross sections. By cross section, what we mean effectively is overall shape of the blade. Some cross sections are a lot better for cutting than others. Now, when I first bought this sword, it didn't even cross my mind to do any kind of cutting tests or cutting practice with it. And someone actually commented and said, when are you doing a cutting test with it? And honestly, it never even occurred to me to do it at that time. But as I've watched other sword reviewers like Scholagrim, Schola Gladiatoria, and Shadiversity, I've learned a little bit more about cutting practice. And so I've started kind of leaning into that a little bit and trying to learn more about what makes a good cutting sword versus what makes a good chopping sword or just plain a not good cutting sword. And to that extent, the cross-section on this sword seems very decent. It is double-edged, like I believe I mentioned earlier, as are most Jian. As you can see here, hopefully that's coming into focus okay. And we have this very gentle bevel, primary bevel, right down to the edge. There is no visible or pronounced, I should say, secondary bevel for the edge. What that effectively means is you end up with a cross section that gives very little resistance when cutting, which is good because the more resistance you have, the harder it is going to be to actually cut with. So I came to a realization at one point that I had many swords and I had did cutting tests and cutting practice with all of them except for this one, the very first one that I got. So I decided to take this out and start doing some cutting practice with it. I will say from a durability standpoint, I nicked my cutting stand, which is made of 2x6s, a couple of times. I actually took the corner off of my cutting stand, just neatly sliced through it with this. I had no edge deformation. I had no rolling, no chipping, nothing like that. So I do believe that the construction on the sword is quite good. Likewise, I was able to cut tatami with it relatively well, but one of the challenges that I ran into, and this is something that somebody even mentioned in the comments on my original video, is the handle on this sword is completely round, completely cylindrical. The challenge that brings is it's difficult to find whenever you're swinging to find your edge alignment, because if your edges turn one way or the other just slightly from your swing, then you're not going to get a good cut with it. So that is definitely a problem with this handle, is finding that edge alignment. Now, I have found that if I hold fairly high on the guard, that gives me that little bit of oval shape to figure out where my edge is. And further, I've also kind of determined what I thought was a one-handed sword, because of the size, because I didn't know anything about swords, is really more of a hand and a half sword, because as long as I've got my hand on the hilt and I hold it kind of like a katana, except much further up, then I can typically get pretty good edge alignment and get much more consistent cuts that way. But it's still difficult to do, even though the cross section is doing a lot of work and the blade shape is doing a lot of work for me, and the blade was sufficiently sharp without having to sharpen it. That completely round handle makes it really difficult to get good edge alignment. So that's one of the issues that I've run into with the sword once I started trying to do actual practical work with it. Now, one of the other issues that I ran into is the very first time that the blade contacted that cutting stand, I started feeling something kind of loose. And I determined two things. For one, the pommel cap came loose. I mentioned in the original video that the fixtures, which are made of brass, antiqued brass, were just simply glued on. And that can be fine, but the glue had grown to be bitter over time. Bitter. I haven't tasted the glue. I eat glue, but not this kind. The glue had started to turn brittle, and had the fixtures basically started to come loose both here and on the scabbard, which I didn't know, because before I was just basically using it as a wall hanger. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing that I noticed was the blade, after hitting the cutting stand once, had started to work loose in the handle. So what I ended up doing is pulling the pommel cap off and taking a look at the tang, and saw that it is a threaded tang. One thing that I have learned over the year is that many swords are made to be torn down easily for repair and maintenance. So I unscrewed the threading, the nut on the thread, and removed the handle, and discovered that we have the dreaded rat tail. Now, it's not quite the dreaded rat tail, and what I mean by that is there are multiple tang types, and this is another thing that I've learned in buying swords. One of the tang types is called a rat tail, and typically what that refers to in American sword usage and Western sword usage, and seems like it varies a little bit with East Asia. They use the rat tail a little bit differently. In fact, my kukris, they refer to that as a rat tail tang on most of those kukris, except where they list as full tang. But what we usually refer to rat tails are a weld right at the tang, right at the base of the blade. So they take the tang, they put it up against the shoulder of the blade and weld it on. That can be extremely dangerous. Normally that type of tang is only found on cheap wall hangers, so stainless steel swords that are not really made for use. They're made to look nice and hang on a wall. But oftentimes a sword will fail there, and if the sword fails there, the blade will just become a projectile at that point and go flying off the handle. So this sword has a partial tang, so the tang does not run the full length of the grip, unfortunately. And it's welded. The threaded bit that holds the handle to the tang has been welded on, and it's a pretty rough weld at that. Now, I'm not as concerned about that as I would be a full genuine rat tail, because if it does break, it's going to break further down the handle instead of being right at the blade. So I don't think, with this being secured with the sheath retainer and the guard, that the blade will actually come loose and go flying, but it certainly could break at that weld point. That was very disappointing to see, because even though the sword isn't especially expensive, it's expensive enough that I would really have preferred a full tang on that. So I've learned a little bit about tangs and the different tang types. Ideally, you want a full tang, one that runs the length of the handle, and not anything with welds on it. In fact, I've seen a lot of forges now are advertising their swords as having a full tang with a thread on the tang itself. I get probably why they do that is because they can pre-make a bunch of thread pieces, and then after the sword is made, weld it on. And if they try to thread the tang itself, it could potentially goober the tang up and then basically ruin the whole sword. So I see why they probably do that as a cost savings measure, but it is unfortunate for something that is purported to be a functional piece and was about $300, maybe a little over $300. So a little bit disappointed with that for sure. I'm also disappointed that the fixture started to come loose. What I did to fix that is I actually, for one, I have learned that glue is actually pretty common and is even historically accurate to a certain extent for securing things to swords. So I went ahead and used a little bit of glue and re-glued the fixtures, but further, I took a brass hammer and hammered the fixtures onto the wood, both onto the grip. I think I was saying handle earlier, and I apologize if that triggered anybody. Again, I don't know a ton about swords yet, and I'm still getting the terminologies down, so I'm going to start calling those grip instead of handle. My apologies for that. And then I hammered the fixtures down. I glued first, and then hammered the fixtures down on the scabbard, because those were also starting to work loose. So that's another thing that I've learned is, yes, you can work on your own swords to a certain extent, and sometimes fix things that break or start to fall apart or reinforce them a little bit. I went ahead and took this sword back out after I made those adjustments, and I did quite a bit more cutting with it. I even nicked my cutting stand again, and I didn't have anything work loose. And this, so far, everything has been very snug and very tight. Now, one issue too with the tang and with the grip, I almost said handle again, is it's very hollow. I've heard, just reading online from Sword Buyer's Guide and a few other places, that the response usually from the forges that make these say that this style, you can't really put a solid core handle or grip on there. And I'm not sure how much I buy that. I tend to think that if the grip is solid, as a solid core, then they're going to have to do a lot more fitting. So having a big open hollow piece lets them make a bunch of them and then put them on an assembly line effectively, and with these being production swords, not custom swords, and then just fit them on a mass scale to a bunch of different swords without having to fit them individually, and then basically count on the threads or glue or whatever to hold them on. So that's another thing that I've learned is pretty common with these Jian, is they do tend to have pretty hollow grips. One thing that I talked about is how light the sword felt in the first video, and I will say I still feel that way. I actually still feel like the balance is pretty good on this. The balance point on it is just in front of the guard. So a little bit sword heavy, a little bit blade heavy, but not terrible. And it is quite usable as a two-handed sword, provided that you can work around or practice around that very cylindrical grip. So as far as wood and things like that goes, again, other than the hollow grip and then the scabbard, the fixtures coming loose on the scabbard, not really anything to report there. It seems totally fine and totally usable for what it is. But yeah, so there you go. A little bit of a different perspective on this sword from what I had whenever I first took a look at it, because before, I never really intended to use it. I had planned on taking it, putting it on the wall, and admiring it periodically, maybe swinging it around. But then as I've learned that you can actually use swords to cut things without damaging them, I decided to try that. So I thought I'd revisit it now because my perspective has changed a little bit. I'm not as pleased with it as I was when I first got it, now that I've learned kind of what to look out for in a quality sword. But overall, I still don't think it's bad for the price. I mean, it's still a very attractive piece, but there are definitely things that could be better on it. And if this had been a full tang sword, I think the fixture issue would be almost a non-issue because, again, I corrected that myself with some glue and elbow grease. But the tang issue could potentially be an issue later on down the road, which is a little bit unfortunate, again, because the cross-section of this, the edge is quite good and the material is quite good as well. So there you have it, a little bit of a revised review on the Noble Plants Jian, almost did it right there. The Noble Plants Jian from Iron Tiger Forge. So this is Jay. Hope you liked the video. Please click like if you did. Be sure to subscribe to us and check out our backlog. And if you're interested in helping support us, check out the link to our Patreon page. And I'll see you again soon next time.